Sir Edmund's royal guard palm landed across the boy's cheek with the force that sent him staggering backward. The sound of the slap carried across the cobblestone courtyard, silencing the hum of activity as servants and guards froze in place. The boy, no older than 12, clutched his face in shock, wide eyes welling with tears as he stared up at the towering guard before him. "How dare you?" Edmund spat, his voice slicing through silence after a moment's pause. This boy, in rags for clothes, quivered under Edmund's gaze, one hand clasping a battered satchel close to his chest. "This is royal ground, not some market square for urchins such as yourself. I did not mean any harm," he stammered, trying to speak, his voice breaking with the effort. With a backward step, bare feet scraped on stone. Edmund sneered, stepping forward and towering over the boy. "No harm?" he spat. "You don't belong here. If I catch you skulking around again, you'll answer to more than just my hand." The boy flinched, but didn't run. Instead, he held onto the satchel even tighter, his small frame trembling with the effort to stay upright. He opened his mouth to say something, but Edmund cut him off with an impatient growl. "Enough! Be gone before I drag you to the dungeons myself." With that, the boy turned and bolted toward the gates, his feet slapping against the stone as he disappeared into the bustling marketplace beyond. Edmund watched him go, a look of contempt upon his face. He brushed his hands together as if to shake the interaction off and muttered under his breath, "Street rats, they multiply like vermin." As he turned back to resume his patrol, something on the ground caught his eye. A small golden object gleamed in the sunlight, partially hidden among the cobblestones. Edmund bent down and picked it up, turning it over in his hand. It was a medallion, surprisingly heavy for its size and engraved with an intricate design. The instant his fingers closed around it, a strange unease settled over him. The metal was warm, almost unnaturally so, and as he examined it closer, he saw a faint engraving of a royal crest, a mark he recognized instantly. "What in the name of—" Edmund muttered, his voice trailing off as a sense of dread began to creep into his chest. Before he could collect his thoughts, a breathless voice called out behind him. "Sir Edmund!" He turned to see one of the older stewards of the palace make his way toward him with hastening steps and a countenance that bespoke concern. "There is urgent news from His Majesty," he said in stumbling words. "A boy carrying a medallion with the royal crest. He is to be brought into the palace without delay. He mustn't be harmed at any cost." Edmund's blood ran cold. His hand clutched the medallion as if its warmth was an accusation. Before his mind came the frightened face of that boy, followed by the sting of his slap. Beyond the gates, that boy was running. And Edmund finally realized in a rising horror he had just made a terrible mistake. Edmund stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The medallion seemed to burn hotter in his hand as the steward's words echoed in his mind. Could he find the boy in time, or would the consequences of his actions be irreversible? Edmund paced the courtyard, the medallion still clutched tightly in his hand, his mind racing. The steward's words echoed in his ears, colliding with the image of the boy's tear-streaked face. Why hadn't he paused to listen? Why had his temper gotten the better of him? He cursed under his breath, the weight of his own arrogance settling heavily on his shoulders. It was warmer now, as if it mocked him. He flipped it over, observing the detailed design. Undeniably, it was the royal crest, yet it seemed older, more decorative than the emblem used nowadays. Around its edges were symbols Edmund couldn't understand, as foreign as the situation he now found himself in. A cold sweat was developing on his brow. This is too much. If he found that the boy was with this medallion, then he wasn't simply some street urchin. He could be someone important, someone dangerous to offend. Edmund's gut twisted with the thought. His thoughts were broken by the sharp clatter of boots on stone as another guard approached, his face set in a tense mask. "Sir Edmund," he said, his voice low, "there's an incident reported near the marketplace. A boy of the steward's description has been spotted running from two men. Witnesses said he seemed terrified." Edmund felt a vice tighten in his chest. "Chased?" he repeated, though he knew the answer. "Yes, sir," the guard replied. "They didn't appear to be guards or city watch, likely mercenaries. His Majesty has been informed, and orders are to retrieve the boy at all costs." Edmund swore under his breath and barked, "Gather a search party. Sweep the marketplace and surrounding alleys." He hesitated, his pride warring with his sense of duty, before finally adding, "I'll join the search myself." The guard's eyes widened in surprise, but he nodded. "Yes, sir." Within moments, Edmund strode through the bustle of the marketplace, the medallion tucked now into his belt. The cheerful din of merchants calling out their wares and customers haggling prices grated on his nerves as he scanned the crowd for any sign of the boy. His eyes picked up glimpses of children darting between stalls, but not one of them was the boy he sought. Then he saw it. A flash of that same threadbare tunic disappearing into a narrow alley. Edmond's heart leapt to his throat as he broke into a run, his armor clanking with each step. Rounding the corner in time, he could have sworn that he had just seen a boy with a satchel clambering over a stack of crates. "Stop!" Edmund yelled, voice echoing off alley walls. The boy froze for a fraction of a second, his head snapping toward the sound. Edmund saw the panic in his eyes, the fear etched into his small face. But before he could move to intercept, two burly figures emerged from the shadows further down the alley. The men were rough-looking, with unkempt beards and weapons strapped to their belts. One of them grinned, revealing crooked teeth. "Well, look what we have here," he sneered, stepping toward the boy. "Back off," Edmund barked, drawing his sword and leveling it at the men. The steel gleamed in the dim light. "This boy is under royal protection." The grin vanished, and in its place came a scowl. "Royal protection, you say?" he growled. "Doesn't look like anyone's protecting him now." He reached for the boy. Edmund stepped between them, his blade flickering as he swung it, warningly. The other man pulled back, eyeing the sword warily. Seizing his opportunity, the young boy darted behind the back of Edmund and clutched his leather satchel like a shield. "Please," he whispered, "don't let them take me." Edmund didn't say a word. His mind reeled as the pieces fell into place. If these men were after the boy, then the medallion must be far more significant than he'd realized. And the boy, he was no ordinary child. But who was he? And what did he carry that could draw such dangerous attention? "Stand down," Edmund growled, his voice low and threatening. "You don't want to cross the royal guard." The first mercenary hesitated, glancing at his companion. But the second man wasn't so easily deterred. He drew a dagger from his belt and smirked. "Oh, I think we do." Before Edmund could act, he lunged at him. The blade swung to block, its ringing loud against his attacker's steel as the tussle dragged on through this desperate alley fight. One boy screaming, scrambling backward toward crates. Every swing of his sword was met with resistance, every move calculated to keep the boy out of harm's way. But the mercenaries were relentless, their attacks growing more aggressive with each passing moment. Edmund's breath came in ragged gasps as he fought to hold them off, his mind racing with questions he didn't have time to answer. Finally, with a well-placed strike, Edmund sent one of the men flying, his dagger skittering across the ground. The other man hesitated, glancing between Edmund and his fallen comrade, before seeming to decide that the fight wasn't worth the risk. With a muttered curse, he grabbed his partner by the arm and dragged him to his feet. "This isn't over," the man spat at Edmund. "The boy doesn't belong to you." Edmund didn't lower his sword until the two men disappeared into the shadows. Then he turned to the boy, who was still huddled against the crates, his chest heaving with fear. "Who are you?" Edmund demanded, his voice harsh but laced with urgency. "And why are they after you?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his satchel and pulled out a scroll, its edges gilded with gold. He held it out with trembling hands, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "You need to take me to the king," he whispered, "before it's too late." The sight of the gilded scroll in the boy's shaking hands made Edmund's brain swim with confusion and unease. Elaborate details on the parchment spoke unmistakably of royalty. It was no simple thing he held in this quivering child's hands and raised questions he did not want to hear. "What is this?" Edmund barked impatiently. The boy clutched the scroll tighter, shrinking back. "It's meant for the king," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," Edmund snapped, stepping closer. He wasn't in the mood for riddles, not after what he'd just endured in that alley. The boy flinched but didn't answer, his wide eyes darting toward the shadows as though expecting the mercenaries to reappear at any moment. Before Edmund could press him further, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the alley. His grip tightened on his sword as he turned toward the noise, expecting another fight. Instead, a palace guard rounded the corner, panting heavily. The man's face was flushed with exertion and his eyes went wide as he saw Edmund. "Sir Edmund!" the guard gasped, doubling over to catch his breath. There's been an attack at the palace." Edmund froze. "What kind of attack?" "An assassination attempt on His Majesty," the guard said, his voice trembling. "The perpetrators escaped, but they left behind evidence orders from an unknown faction targeting the royal family." The boy made a little involuntary noise, and Edmund's gaze snapped to him. The child's face had gone pale, his knuckles white, where he clutched the scroll. "What does this have to do with him?" Edmund demanded, jerking his sword in the boy's direction. "Speak, boy, now." The boy stammered. His chest heaved as he struggled to find the words. Finally, he whispered, "They're after me because of what I know." "What you know?" Edmund repeated, disbelieving. "You're a child. What could you possibly—" The boy cut him off, his voice rising with an equal mix of fear and defiance. "I'm not just a child. I'm the king's nephew." The revelation hit Edmund like a punch to the gut. He staggered back a step, his sword dipping as he stared at the boy in disbelief. The king's nephew? It couldn't be. The king's only sibling, his younger brother, had died years ago, leaving behind no known heirs. This boy's claim was impossible. "You're lying," Edmund said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're just trying to save yourself." The boy stared at him, his eyes ablaze with determination. "The medallion. The scroll, it's all proof. My father entrusted it to me before he was killed. They've been hunting me ever since." Edmund's mind was reeling. The medallion, with its ancient crest, the scroll carrying the king's seal, the desperation in the boy. It all began to fall into place in a way that soured his stomach. If what the boy said was true, then Edmund had just struck the heir to the throne. Before he could respond, the boy grabbed his arm, his small fingers gripping the leather of Edmund's gauntlet with surprising strength. "You have to take me to the king," he pleaded, his voice urgent. "He's in danger, and so am I. They won't stop until they kill us both." Edmund hesitated, caught between his duty and his own disbelief. Could this boy really be who he said he was? And if so, what did that make Edmund's actions earlier? The slap. The accusation seemed to wrap around his neck like a noose. The sound of distant shouting pierced his thoughts. The mercenaries had returned, their voices echoing through narrow streets. Edmund cursed under his breath, tightening his grip on his sword. "We need to move," he growled. "Now." The boy nodded, clutching his satchel and scroll as Edmund led him deeper into the twisting alleys. The marketplace was no longer an option. They needed a secure route back to the palace. Every shadow seemed to hold danger, every sound a harbinger of pursuit. As they ran, the boy spoke, his words rushed and disjointed. "My father. He knew something about the king's council. There's a traitor, someone who wants the throne for themselves. That's why they killed him. That's why they're after me." "A traitor?" Edmund growled, his anger flared. "Who?" The boy shook his head, pale in the face. "I don't know. My father didn't trust anybody, not even the king, and so told me only to run and deliver this to his majesty." Edmund's mind was racing. If there was a traitor within the king's inner circle, no one was to be trusted, not even the guards patrolling the palace now. And here he was, escorting the most important boy in the kingdom through streets teeming with hired killers. They turned a corner and almost ran into a group of palace guards. Edmund raised his hand, ready to issue an order, but something in the guards' expressions froze him cold. Their eyes were cold, their stances too stiff. These men weren't here to help. "Hand over the boy," the leader said, his voice low and menacing. Edmund stepped in front of the boy, his sword at the ready. "Over my dead body," the leader smirked. "That can be arranged." The boy tugged on Edmund's arm. "They're with the traitor," he whispered. "We have to get out of here." As the guards began to move towards him, Edmund's grasp on his sword tightened. The chances were against them, and his instincts seemed to scream. It was but the opening act of a much greater peril game. There was nowhere to run. And in that moment, Edmund knew the palace was not a haven, but merely a figment of safety he had wanted to believe in. The traitorous guards closed in, their eyes fixed upon the boy, and Edmund's heart raced in his chest. The alley now seemed to have shrunk further, the walls pressed near as the weight of his choices fell squarely on him. There was no time for thinking, only to act. Edmund raised his sword, its edge keen in the dim light, and planted himself before the boy. "Stay behind me," he growled over his shoulder. The leader of the rogue guards smirked, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his sword. "You're making a mistake, Sir Edmund. Hand over the boy, and we can all walk away from this." Edmund's jaw clenched. "I've made one mistake today, and I won't make another. You'll have to kill me first." The smirk had faded. So be it. The leader made a quick, violent gesture. His men charged, the first guard in, his blade flashing in the air. Edmund parried with a grunt. The clash of steel on steel echoed down the alley. He shifted, blocking another strike and countering with a precise swing that forced his attacker to stumble back. "Run!" Edmund yelled at the boy, who was frozen with fear. "Find a way out of here." The boy looked around, his little body quivering, before he suddenly ran towards a small gap between two buildings. One of the guards tried to cut him off, but Edmund moved in a flash, his sword slicing through the air between them. The guard recoiled with a snarl, blood dripping from his arm. The leader's voice cut through the chaos. "Enough playing! Kill the guard and capture the boy!" Two men rushed Edmund at once. He barely managed to block the first strike, twisting to avoid the second. His movements were quick but desperate. Every swing of his sword drained his strength, and every clash of blades reminded him that he was outnumbered. He couldn't keep this up much longer. Behind him, the boy squeezed through the gap, clutching his satchel as though it held his very life. Edmund risked a glance over his shoulder. Relief washed over him as he saw the boy disappear into the shadows. But that split-second distraction cost him. A blade sliced across his shoulder, and he hissed in pain, staggering backward. "Drop your weapon," one of the guards shouted, pressing the advantage. Edmund ignored him, gripping his sword tighter despite the blood dripping from his wound. He wouldn't fall here. Not before ensuring the boy's safety. Summoning the last of his strength, Edmund counterattacked. His blade whirled in an arc, forcing his enemies to retreat. He fought like a cornered animal, his movements fueled by sheer determination rather than skill. Another guard fell to the ground, clutching his side, but Edmund knew he couldn't hold them all off forever. Suddenly, a sharp whistle pierced the air. The rogue guards paused, their heads snapping toward the sound. Edmund, panting and bloodied, turned to see a group of royal guards entering the alley. For a moment he felt a flicker of hope. Reinforcements at last. But that hope was short-lived. The leader of the traitorous guards stepped forward, his expression dark. "These men are with us. Stand down, Edmund. You're surrounded." The blood drained from Edmund's face as the truth hit him like a blow. The corruption ran deeper than he'd imagined. These weren't just a few rogue guards, they were part of a larger conspiracy, a network that extended into the heart of the palace. "You've chosen the wrong side," Edmund spat, his voice hoarse but defiant. The leader chuckled. "The wrong side? No, Sir Edmund, you have. That boy is a threat to the kingdom. You're risking everything for a child who shouldn't even exist." Edmund's grip on his sword tightened. "The only threat to the kingdom is men like you." The leader's smile vanished. "Enough of this." He raised his hand, signaling the combined forces to close in. Edmund steeled himself for the final assault, knowing it would be his last stand. Before the guards could attack him, a deafening roar rang out down the alley. The ground shook beneath their feet as a massive horse thundered into view, its rider cloaked in the deep blue of the royal family's elite guard. "Stand down, traitors!" the rider bellowed, his voice commanding and unmistakable. It was Captain Harrow, leader of the palace's most loyal soldiers. His sword was drawn, and his steely gaze swept over the gathered men. The rogue guards hesitated, their confidence faltering. Harrow dismounted in one fluid motion, his presence radiating authority. He pointed his blade at the leader. "Drop your weapons, or face the king's justice." The leader sneered but didn't move. "You're too late, Captain. The boy is already lost." Harrow's eyes narrowed. "The only thing lost here is your honor." In the confusion, Edmund staggered to Harrow's side, blood dripping from his shoulder. "The boy escaped," he said, his voice low. "But they're after him. He has the scroll." Harrow nodded, his face grim. "Then we must find him before they do. If that scroll falls into the wrong hands." He didn't finish the thought. But Edmund knew the kingdom's future hung in the balance, and the boy was the key. Behind them, the traitors reassembled, their hesitation giving way to renewed resolve. Edmund and Harrow raised their swords, their determination not shaken by the odds. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The boy's feet pounded the cobblestones as he sprinted through the twisting city streets, his satchel bouncing against his side. Every breath was a gasp, every shadow a threat. He clutched the scroll tightly, his fingers trembling as though they could feel the weight of the kingdom's future within the parchment. Behind him, the din of battle was muffled. Clashing swords, barked orders, and Edmund's unmistakable roar of defiance. The guard who had struck him earlier was now his only protector, and the boy's chest tightened with guilt. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen, but it had to. It was the only way to expose the truth. The boy ducked into a dimly lit passageway and pressed himself against the wall, his small frame disappearing into the shadows. His heart thundered in his ears as he peeked around the corner, scanning for signs of pursuit. For now, the streets were quiet. But he knew it wouldn't last. He opened the satchel and carefully retrieved the medallion and the scroll. The medallion was warm to the touch, its intricate engraving a silent promise. He unrolled the scroll, his eyes running over words in his father's familiar hand. There it all was. The names, the plans, the betrayal. There was the council member who had masterminded his father's assassination. He was the one who made the king dependent upon all the wrong advisors. It was a grab for the throne, pure and simple. A treacherous coup soaked in blood. One name in particular jumped from the bottom of the parchment. Captain Harrow. The boy's hands began to shake. Harrow, the man who just now rode into battle to save him, was the very traitor his father had warned him about. It was Harrow, the king's most trusted military advisor, who engineered this whole conspiracy, hiring mercenaries to hunt the boy, dispatching guards loyal to his cause, and now masquerading as protector of the crown while plotting its downfall. The boy's breath hitched. If he exposed this truth to Edmund, would the guard even believe him? Or would Harrow's reputation shield him from suspicion? He had no allies left, except one. The king. The boy clambered to his feet, determination replacing caution. Tucking the scroll back in his satchel, slipping through alleys in the direction of the palace gates. Every step seemed to him a running out of time. Harrow wouldn't scruple to remove him the moment the fight was over. Edmond's patronage would be worthless when the captain decided upon that. The boy reached the palace walls, his small frame slipping through a servant's entrance unnoticed. He kept to the shadows, navigating the familiar corridors with practiced ease. It wasn't the first time he had been here, but it was the first time he felt like an intruder in his own home. At last he gained the throne room. The huge doors stood before him, the carvings on them representing the greatness of the kingdom. Summoning every inch of courage, the boy pushed them open and stepped inside. The king sat at the far end of the hall, his face weary and lined with age. Beside him stood Captain Harrow, his armor gleaming and his expression calm. The sight of the captain sent a shiver down the boy's spine, but he forced himself forward. "Your Majesty!" he cried, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. The king looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Who is this child?" Before the boy could reply, Harrow stepped forward, resting his hand on the hilt of his sword. "Your Majesty, this is the boy who has caused so much trouble. He carries stolen property. He cannot be trusted." "That's a lie," the boy shouted, holding the satchel close to his chest. "I carry the truth my father died to protect." The king's eyes widened, and he stared, his gaze darting back and forth between the boy and Harrow. "Your father?" The boy surged forward, drawing the medallion from the satchel and holding it high. "I am Thomas, son of Prince Alden. My father was your brother." The blood fled the king's face as a murmur ran over the room. Harrow's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, his mask of serenity slipping. "I have proof," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger. He opened the satchel and unrolled the scroll, presenting it to the king. "This scroll reveals everything. Who betrayed my father? Who has been plotting against you? Who wants to take your throne?" The king took the scroll with trembling hands, and his eyes scanned the parchment. With every word, darker and darker grew his features. His lips pressed to a thin line. At last he looked up, his gaze locking on Harrow. "Is this true?" the king demanded, in a voice that was cold as ice. Harrow didn't even flinch. "Your Majesty, that scroll is a fabrication. The boy is desperate to save himself. He has no proof." Small as he was, there was an unmistakable core of defiance running through Thomas now. "You've lied enough, Harrow. My father trusted you and you betrayed him. You sent mercenaries to kill me. You're the one who gave the order to attack the palace today." For a moment, Harrow's composure broke. His sword flashed out of its scabbard. The blade winked coldly in his hand, leveled at Thomas's heart. "You should have kept hidden, boy," he spat. "You seal your fate thus." The doors burst open and in stumbled Edmund, covered in blood yet still alive. His gaze latched onto the scene before him. The boy, the scroll, and Harrow's drawn sword. "Harrow," Edmund growled, taking a step forward, "what in the king's name are you doing?" Harrow's eyes darted between Edmund and the king, calculating his odds. He lunged toward Thomas, but Edmund was faster. With a roar, the royal guard intercepted the blow, his sword clashing against Harrow's with bone-jarring force. The fight was brief, but brutal. Edmund's determination, fueled by guilt and anger, overwhelmed Harrow's precision. In the end, Harrow's sword clattered to the ground and Edmund drove him to his knees. The king stood, his voice shaking with fury. "Captain Harrow, you have betrayed the crown, and you will answer for your crimes." Harrow, defeat twisting his face, spat on the ground. "You're blind, old man. The throne is weak and I would have made it strong." "Take him away," the king ordered, and guards rushed to drag the traitor from the room. As silence fell, the king turned to Thomas, his expression softening. "You are truly Alden's son?" Thomas nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I am, Your Majesty. And I'm here to finish what my father started." The king knelt, pulling Thomas into a tight embrace. Edmund, standing nearby, felt a strange sense of relief and a newfound respect for the boy he had so gravely underestimated. Everything was different now. The future of the kingdom had been left to a child, and Edmund silently swore to protect him, whatever the cost. The sun was setting as Edmund stood on the palace balcony, overlooking the sprawling city below. The warm, golden light softened the jagged rooftops and cast long shadows across the streets. But the warmth did little to ease the chill in his chest. His hand instinctively brushed the bandage on his shoulder, a reminder of the events that had nearly cost both him and the boy their lives. Inside the throne room, Thomas stood before the king, the scroll and medallion laid reverently on a velvet-draped table. The boy's head was high, his posture steady, despite the enormity of what he had faced. Edmond couldn't help but admire him. Courage like that didn't come easily, especially for someone so young. The king placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, his expression one of both grief and pride. "You are your father's son," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber. "Prince Alden would be proud of you." "I only wish I had known the truth sooner," Thomas nodded solemnly. "I didn't want to believe it either, Your Majesty, but my father trusted me to carry this burden, and I couldn't let him down." The king glanced at the scroll, then back at the boy. "The betrayal cuts deep, but with this truth, we can root out the corruption that has plagued this court. Your bravery has saved this kingdom." Thomas lowered his gaze, his voice softening. "I only did what I had to. For my father. For the people." Edmond stepped forward, his armor catching the fading light. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing low. The boy showed courage far beyond his years, but the fault lies with me. I wronged him, and I failed to see the truth until it was almost too late. The king turned to Edmund, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "You erred, Sir Edmund, but you also stood by him when it mattered most. You faced overwhelming odds to protect him even when you didn't fully understand his importance. That is the duty of a royal guard." Edmund felt the weight of those words. Duty. It had been his guiding principle, but arrogance had blinded him to what duty truly meant. He met the boy's eyes, his voice steady but filled with regret. "Thomas, I owe you an apology. I judged you unfairly and put you in danger. I failed to honor my oath to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "You made a mistake," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "But you also risked your life to fix it. That's what matters." The boy's words hit Edmund harder than any blow he had taken in battle. He bowed his head, his chest tightening with a mixture of shame and gratitude. The king's voice broke the silence. "This ordeal has reminded us all of an important truth. Power and loyalty must be earned, not assumed. We cannot allow arrogance, betrayal, or fear to guide our actions." He turned to the gathered court, his gaze sweeping over the nobles and guards who had assembled to witness the resolution. "Today a boy taught us what it means to be brave, what it means to protect not just the crown, but the heart of the kingdom itself. Let this be a lesson to us all." The court murmured its agreement, heads nodding in respect. Thomas, standing tall beside the king, looked every bit the royal heir his father had hoped he would become. As the crowd began to disperse, Edmund approached Thomas. "You'll make a fine prince," he said, his voice quiet. "Better than most men I've known." Thomas smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I'll need people I can trust, people like you." The words caught Edmund off guard, but he nodded, a spark of determination reigniting within him. "Then you'll have me, always." Thomas extended his small hand, and Edmund took it, the boy's grip surprisingly firm. In that moment, the past seemed to fade away, replaced by a future that, while uncertain, felt brighter than it had in years. As the boy returned to the king's side, Edmund remained on the balcony, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. He thought of the lessons he had learned, the mistakes he had made, and the courage of a boy who had reminded him what true duty and honor looked like. A royal guard protects the kingdom, but more importantly, its people. Edmund swore to himself that he would never forget that again. And far above the city, the night settled over the palace, calm and full of promise, as the kingdom took its first steps toward a better tomorrow. The sun was setting as Edmund stood on the palace balcony, overlooking the sprawling city below. The warm, golden light softened the jagged rooftops and cast long shadows across the streets, but the warmth did little to ease the chill in his chest. His hand instinctively brushed the bandage on his shoulder, a reminder of the events that had nearly cost both him and the boy their lives. Inside the throne room, Thomas stood before the king. On a table, velvet draped, he had laid the scroll and medallion reverently. The head of the boy was held high, his posture unrelenting despite what he faced in its enormity. Edmund couldn't help but admiration for him. Courage just didn't come easily hand in hand, especially when someone so young was returned. The king laid a hand on Thomas's shoulder, his face a mask of sorrow and pride. "You are your father's son," he said, his voice echoing off the chamber. "Prince Alden would be proud of you. I only wish I had known the truth sooner." Thomas nodded solemnly. "I didn't want to believe it either, Your Majesty, but my father trusted me to carry this burden, and I couldn't let him down." The king glanced at the scroll, then back at the boy. "The betrayal cuts deep, but with this truth, we can root out the corruption that has plagued this court. Your bravery has saved this kingdom." Thomas looked down, his voice quieting. "I only did what I had to. For my father. For the people." Edmond came forward then, his armor glinting in the dying light. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing low. The boy showed courage far beyond his years. But the fault lies with me. I wronged him, and I failed to see the truth until it was almost too late. The king now turned to Edmund, his eyes sharp but not unkind. You erred, Sir Edmund, but you also stood by him when it mattered most. You faced overwhelming odds to protect him, even when you didn't fully understand his importance. That is the duty of a royal guard. Edmund felt the weight of those words. Duty. It had been his guiding principle, but pride had blinded him to what that word meant. He met the boy's eyes, his voice steady but full of regret. Thomas, I owe you an apology. I judged you unfairly and put you in danger. I failed to honor my oath to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. You made a mistake, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. But you also risked your life to fix it. That's what matters. The boy's words hit Edmund harder than any blow he had taken in battle. He bowed his head, his chest tightening with a mixture of shame and gratitude. The king's voice broke the silence. This ordeal has reminded us all of an important truth. Power and loyalty must be earned, not assumed. We cannot allow arrogance, betrayal, or fear to guide our actions. He turned to the assembled court, his eyes sweeping across the nobles and guards who had gathered to witness the resolution. Today a boy taught us what it means to be brave, what it means to protect not just the crown, but the heart of the kingdom itself. Let this be a lesson to us all. The court murmured in assent, heads nodding in respect. Thomas, standing tall beside the king, was every inch the royal heir his father had hoped he would become. As the crowd began to disperse, Edmund approached Thomas. You'll make a fine prince, he said, his voice quiet. Better than most men I've known. Thomas smiled faintly. Maybe, but I'll need people I can trust, people like you. The words caught Edmund off guard, but he nodded, a spark of determination reigniting within him. Then you'll have me, always. Thomas extended his small hand, and Edmund took it, the boy's grip surprisingly firm. In that moment, the past seemed to fade away, replaced by a future that, while uncertain, felt brighter than it had in years. As the boy was taken back to the king's side, Edmund stood on the balcony, seeing the first stars in the sky already darkening. He thought of lessons learnt, mistakes made, and of a boy's courage that reminded him of what true duty and honor looked like. A royal guard protects the kingdom, but most importantly its people. Edmund made a silent promise to himself to never forget that again. Far above the city, the night settled over the palace calm and full of promise, while the kingdom took the first steps toward a better tomorrow.